Hello, welcome to Edge-CGI. My name's Jason Ault. This is part 4 of a 5-part tutorial series. In this tutorial we're going to cover render to texture and lighting. So we'll go ahead and get started. So in the last video we have unwrapped our treasure chest. So here we can see the unwraps. Make sure you check out that video if you haven't seen that one. So what we're going to do is we're going to bake these unwraps into our object, which is simple enough. You just convert it to edit poly, and it's going to keep all the unwrap information, so we don't have to worry about losing that or anything like that. I'm also going to go ahead and name this chest, just so I have my naming already set up. The next part is I'm going to go over into Photoshop and I'm going to create 2 textures, and these are just going to be basic textures. So I typically work with game stuff, so I'm just going to go with 1024 by 1024 for my image size. Whoops, 1024. There we go. I'll hit OK. And so what I'm going to do is create a wood grain, and I'm going to create a simple metal. And these are just going to be used as something I'm going to use for my base textures for render to texture. So I've set up 2 brown colors here. I've got a lighter brown and I've got a darker brown. So I'm going to go up into Filter, Render, Fibers. And this actually gives you a pretty decent wood grain. Now I have my variance here set at 32 and my strength also set at 32. That's just a default that I use for wood grain. Problem being, this wood grain is actually going the wrong direction, so I'll just double click my layer here so that it's no longer locked. I'm going to hit Ctrl-T and I'm going to rotate this 90 degrees. Okay, so that's going to be my my base texture. So we'll save that out, save as, and I've got one here already called wood grain. I'll just save over that. And I'm saving it as a Photoshop file. That's fine for the render to texture, but you do want to render as whatever file type will be best for you, so JPEG, Targa, what have you. So that's the wood grain. Now I'm actually going to duplicate and use both images here. So I'm going to rotate this 45 degrees. This is how I'm going to create the metal texture. And I'll just stretch this out. Now typically we don't want to stretch out our images. Oh, my mistake here. Hold on. There we go. Typically we don't want to stretch these out just because it can make them well stretched. But I'm going to end up shrinking this image down a little bit and kind of fixing that for my metal grain. Okay, so that's my brown. Now I'm going to basically get rid of anything that was on the outside of that by hitting selecting and hitting Ctrl-J, which creates a new layer based on that selection that I had. So I'm just going to get rid of this other one here. Okay, I'm going to desaturate this, which gives me my gray. I'm going to hit Ctrl-J to create a new layer again. Ctrl-T. It doesn't create a new layer, it duplicates the layer, sorry. I'm going to rotate this 90 degrees. And I'm going to set this layer as darken, which is going to overlay those. And I'm doing this so I get kind of this worn metal, kind of scraped metal look. And I'm just going to combine those together. And I'm going to save this one out as dark metal. So I'll just do metal dark and save. And actually, you know what? I wanted to scale this first, so I'm going to go ahead and do this here. Okay, why are we not? There we go. Just looking for my guides to line up here. So I'm going to duplicate this 4 times because the texture does run a little bit big. I'll do this. Getting fumbly with my fingers here. There we go. And getting a little bit of bleed over here, but we can fix that in just a second. Or not bleed over, but a gap in between here. So the way I'm going to fix this is I'm just going to go into my clone stamp, and I've got kind of this, I don't know what the brush is called here, but this brush here, round, fan, whatever. I'm going to sample a selection here and just start painting this out. And I'll do the same thing over this way. There we go. Alright, so that gets rid of that seam that I had there. So I'm going to resave that as metal dark. Yep, replace that. And now I'm going to go to my levels. And I'm going to create the lighter version of this. And save that out. So file, save as, and this one will just be metal. And save. Alright, so we're going to go back into 3ds Max, and we're going to create a couple of materials here to use. So I'm going to just be using just basic standard textures. I'm going to set these up with some settings here that I tested out earlier that I like. So I'm setting my specularity to 44, which just gives me a little bit of a shine to this. And then I'm going to drop in my textures here. So we'll just drop in a bitmap, and I'm going to go to my textures folder, and I'm going to take wood grain and open that up. It's going to ask if I want to collapse layers. I do. And I'm just going to drag that into my diffuse, which is my main color slot. I've also set up some colors that I want to use here for kind of specularity. So for my specularity for the wood, I'm going to type in 162 and 101 and 68. And that gives me kind of a light color here. And then typically for my ambient, normally this will be the same color for both. I'm just going to set this to a dark brown. It shouldn't make too much of a difference on this texture, but just so I have that. So that's going to be my wood texture. So now I'm going to take the little node handle here and drag it onto my object, and I'm going to say display in viewport. So when we were doing our unwraps, just close that for a second, I had set everything up so that the wood grain would wrap around here. And you can see how it follows around here based on how I had set up those UVWs. But obviously I don't want wood grain on the metal parts of this. So what I can do is I'm going to select everything that's wood, which is everything here. I'm going to say edit, select invert. That's all my metal stuff. So now I'm going to make a texture for my metal. So standard. And this is going to use the same settings I had before here. So I'm just going to double click to activate this. 44. And I'm going to drag in my bitmap image, which will be metal. You don't necessarily need the dark one, but I'm going to show you what I'm doing with it just so you get an idea. I'm going to select everything here, hold shift. Oops, I accidentally selected too many. Let's do that again. There we go. And it is a good idea to name these. I'm just kind of doing this for time, for not naming the textures. Dark metal. Alright, so with my light metal selection, I can drag that on. I can also just go up to assign material to selection, and that is going to, let me make sure this shows in viewport, and do the same to this one. Okay, so we're going to see that. Now right now this doesn't look like the best texture in the world, but we're hopefully going to get there by the end of the video. So with everything that was just selected there, select that again. Let's see if I'm able to shrink my selection. That's unfortunate. That would have made this really easy. So what I'm going to do is select all the parts. Actually, I'll just select these manually. So I'm selecting all the parts that are kind of raised up and not on the sides. I'll show you why I'm doing that. I'm actually going to select invert after I do this. Okay, and select invert. I am going to end up putting dark on all of these parts, and I'm going to replace it on the front here. I should have done that in the first place, but okay. So I'm going to turn on select by vertex, which will allow me to select all the top parts here. So I'm going to go through and select all those. And I'll apply that light texture again to those. And then for the lock, I'm going to do the same idea. So I'll select the, why can't I select that? Oh, by vertex is still on. Okay, so I'm going to select all this and that, and assign the light color to that as well. That'll just make everything else darker. So I'm doing this so that I can easily do some texturing, because I will admit that I'm not the strongest when it comes to just hand painting textures. That's not my area of expertise. But I've created this workaround for people who are kind of in the same ship as I am. So now the lights that I'm going to set up, I'm going to import in some lighting. So I'm going to go to Import Merge. So I've got some lighting here that I've already created. And let's see, basic lighting. And I'll talk about that lighting. Okay, so I'm just going to select all these lights. Oops. There we go. So select all those. Okay. So what I've done here is I've created some lights, and I'm going to bake in the textures here. So I've set some lights up around here. They're just Omni lights. I have them as shadow maps. Their intensity is fairly low. I am using a far attenuation, so these lights are they do have a fall off to them. And then my shadow map parameters, I have my bias set really low. I have my size set to what I'm going to have my texture be, which is 1024. And then my sample range, which is defaults to 4, I set to 6. And that's how all of these are essentially set up. And then I've got a spotlight on top that's shining down that's going to light up the top. And then for extra shadows, I just kind of put in this skylight. So if we see what this looks like when it renders, and hopefully it looks all right. All right, so now that that's finished, we can kind of see that it's creating a pretty decent looking wood grain. And this is way more scratched than I want it to be, but those are the things I'm going to change in Photoshop after I do render to texture. So let's walk through render to texture. I'm going to select my object, and something we didn't do in the last video was under our modifier for unwrap, we didn't render out the UVs. So I'm just going to go to Tools, Render UV Template, UVW Template, set it to the size that my texture is going to be, and simply click Render. I rendered off screen there, and I'm going to save that out. So I created a textures folder. I'm just going to call this chest UVW, and I'm going to have that be a actually, I'm going to have it be a JPEG just because I don't want to deal with the alpha channel. Okay, so there's that. I can go ahead and just take that UV thing back off. Now, the render to texture setup is going to be under rendering. Render to texture, the shortcut for that is 0. And so when this pops up, the reason that I named this is because it's automatically going to name some of my textures. So I'm going to tell this that I want to use the existing UV channel that we've already set up, and I'm going to add different texture elements here. So I'm going to do complete, diffuse, shadows, add all. And I'm going to go to these one at a time and tell them all to be 1024. And I'm going to tell them where to save. So I'm going to save them here. I'm just going to let them be the name that's associated here. And I will have the alpha channels with these, just because it makes the next couple steps easy. I'm just going to copy this path so I can paste this into the other ones. So I can just copy and paste that in here. I'm just pressing enter to confirm that. Okay. And then the last part is to press render. It's going to tell me that I'm missing the target slot, so when you render this, you can have it put it into a material. I'm not bothered by that. I don't want to deal with that. And so now it'll render. Okay, so our render is finished. So the final part is going to be, I'm going to disconnect these textures. I'm going to do another render to texture. This one, the reason I'm doing this is so that I can set up colors here that are basically going to be used for selection purposes as I get into Photoshop. So I'm just going to make sure that I have the right stuff still set here. And so I'm going to get rid of this. So this is my overall texture. And it had put a kind of a baked shell on here from the render texture, but we can just delete that. And I'm going to get rid of the complete here and the shadow. And my diffuse, I'm now going to rename that, instead of chest diffuse map, I'm just going to say chest selection. Because what this will do is it'll render out these basic colors, and it'll make it really easy to select these different areas when we get into Photoshop. I can also turn off my lights, which will help this render faster. So I'm going to go ahead and do that just briefly here. So select lights, Control A. I'm just going to hit delete because I have those saved out anyway. And now I'm going to go ahead and hit render again. Alright, I fixed the display issue. I'm going to click render files only. That way it doesn't do the shell thing that it did before. Sorry about the display. I'm not certain what was happening there. So you can see this is going to render a lot faster, and it also doesn't look like this. Let me show you what that looks like in Photoshop, and then we'll move on to the final video. So I'm going to close those out, and I'm going to open up chest selection, UVW, chest complete map, chest diffuse map, and chest shadow map. Okay, so I'm going to end up layering these all together. That concludes this part of the tutorial. Please stay tuned for the rest of the series. Thanks for watching Edge-CGI, and don't forget to subscribe, like, and share if you've enjoyed this tutorial. And thanks for watching.